A few days ago, I posted a video concerning a domestic violence case, or assault on an elderly case, I guess it was, about a woman who threw a coffee cup on the floor and was prosecuted for assault on the elderly. The father and daughter lived next door to each other in various houses on their ranch. Um, he grew up an old cowboy and under the cowboy traditions, etc. A couple of things that come to mind from that case and why I posted it is, first off, we have an elderly gentleman that society is supposed to protect through the legislation of abuse of elderly. So the gold digger comes in, pisses off the daughter, who had been a caretaker for a number of years, caretaker for her father. And the gold digger calls the police. The police come and issue or arrest the daughter for throwing the coffee cup. The gold digger said it was aimed at the father, which the daughter denies. It doesn't really matter, I suppose. But I'm thinking and comparing this to some of the federal cases I've had over the years. One of the cases was involved in the swordfish operation. I listened to 40 hours of wiretap on that case. Another one was a big gambling case in Tulsa. I listened to 60 hours of wiretap on that case. A lot of cases, the investigations have gone on for years, but we have a whole classification of cases that I call agenda cases, where elected officials want to show they're for this or against that, and they do things in order to get votes or get attention or get publicity. And one of the big things a while ago was, the abuse of elderly. Well, there's a maxim in law, a rule of law called the rule of proportionality, a rule on equity. It was sort of stated you shouldn't shoot a mouse with a cannon. And that's what's going on a lot in this country. We're losing all perspective and any prospective sanity. So, think of this on domestic violence cases. If you live in a trailer park or in a projects where the walls are thin, you're going to have a much greater chance of having the police involved if you get into an argument than if you live in a gated community. So right away, the statistics are biased. Secondly, rich people communicate a lot differently than what they would refer to as the peasantry. Many of the uneducated people in this country have to gesticulate or yell at each other or even sometimes touch each other or slap each other because that's their way of communication. So there's a cultural bias there. But white, suburban, middle class, country club, young prosecutors don't see that because they don't have the experience. And so in the case of the daughter, what ended up was the daughter, who'd been a caretaker for 12 years, moved to Missouri. The gold digger quit caring for the old man as soon as the daughter left. He died shortly thereafter, and she ended up inheriting the ranch. My objection there is that you've got police who are not trained psychologists, they're not trained social workers. They think only in one term, and that's prosecution. So it seems to me if you're going to charge somebody with a serious offense like elderly abuse that's going to cause this type of damage, you ought to be a little more thorough in the investigation, which means you just don't take a report from some woman who says that lady threw something at that old man and go arrest and prosecute and things like this. That's not an investigation. They ought to investigate thoroughly, check the background, see how their behavior was, talk to friends, family, etc., to see if that's a 1 in a million occurrence or if it occurs all the time. And somebody ought to analyze the ramifications. Now, it's significant to me that an ex-lawyer or retired lawyer and a minister are the ones that referred the lady to me for defense. They were concerned, and they weren't concerned about the old man. They were concerned about the ramifications of the prosecution. I think one of the reasons they stated that they referred to the case to me was because of the fact that at one time I had, many years ago, ran for the office of district attorney and presumably knew a little bit about the office and could maybe explain things to the people. However, my client was so disgusted with the whole thing, she essentially said, fuck it, and took off and decided it wasn't worth the hassle or the expense, etc. So she took her plea bargain and left. I think this is unfortunate, and I also think it's malpractice on behalf of the district attorney or their staff, a lack of training. You've got somebody who says, oh, this is a hot topic, who's in office. Well, I want to get on to that. I want my constituents to know I don't stand for elderly abuse. I'm against elderly abuse. So let's look for a case where I can get press to show that. Or I'm against domestic violence, or I'm against this, I'm against that, rather than look at the individual case and do justice. So the prosecutor's office becomes a moral entrepreneur rather than a source of justice. And that's what I want to talk about. And that's why I published that old story and what I was trying to refer to. I had another case where a woman drove her child to a daycare center, and one of the neighbors in the apartment house smelled marijuana. So she called social services and said, a woman in my apartment complex just drove her child to daycare center and she'd been smoking weed. Well, social services came and wanted to inspect the child to make sure the child was okay. The child was at the daycare center, which I still can't figure out why the social workers went to the mother's apartment. However, they were accompanied by police, and they talked to the woman. The woman said, yeah, I had a couple tokes before I took my daughter to the daycare center. And so they issued her a summons for illegal use of marijuana and also for driving under the influence of marijuana and a few things such as that. Well, there was a criminal prosecution going on. They dropped the DUI, but they still had the possession. And they also charged her with child abuse by having drugs around her child. Now, her child had spinal bifida and a lot of other problems. And because she had been aware of some of the cases I'd done in the past, she took the child to grandma's. And the police came back to the apartment later on, and she asked them, am I the subject of an investigation? And they said yes. And they wanted to look at the child. And she refused. On my advice, she refused. Because she had been issued a summons. She was the defendant in a criminal case, and she had Fifth Amendment rights. Well, social services didn't think Fifth Amendment applied to them because a child was involved. So this went on and on and on through the courts, and all they wanted to do is they wanted to make sure the child was okay and look at the child. And they could make a check mark on their thing and say, well, I've done my job, etc., etc. But they didn't do their job. They could have talked to the neighbors. They could have talked to the doctor, the pediatrician, etc. But they didn't want it. They didn't care about that. They weren't doing a job. They weren't investigating. They wanted to check a mark on their little box to say that they had seen the child and the child was okay. Then they would have done their jobs. Well, that's bullshit. They didn't do their jobs. They made a mark, a check off. So I said, do your jobs. Go ahead and investigate. Talk to people, see what kind of mother she is. See if the child is abused. You're supposed to gather evidence, not just examine the child and say this is a child and it doesn't look bad, so here's a check mark in a box. That's bullshit. So we go to court and they charged her with child abuse. And we have this prosecutor in Adams County and gets up in front of the judge finally and says to the judge, the only reason that we are here is because defense attorney doesn't know what he's doing. Now, at my age and stage in life, I let that slide and put it down to the ignorance of the county attorney and the fact of the budgetary restraints. That's about the best they can do, I suppose. But in any event, we go back into chambers. And the next thing the lawyer does, he starts talking to my client. And he says, are you willing to go through a test case just over the principle of the Fifth Amendment? Essentially, in talking directly to my client. He shouldn't have been talking to her anyway. And said, why don't you just let us look at the child? We'll say it's okay, and then we can end this thing. And she says, you willing to go through all this just for a test case? She looked at the prosecutor and said, you betcha. And the attorney then looked at me and he says, what the hell do you want? I said, I want you to do your job. I want you to investigate. Social services is supposed to investigate. Let them investigate instead of taking a look at the child and checking things off. So the end result was they did an investigation, supposedly, or at least they told me that. I didn't see any paperwork, but the case got dismissed. But this is the type of sloppiness that we're seeing. And a lot of people are getting hurt because of the sloppiness. And we're getting it because we're trying to prosecute everybody. We're trying to manufacture crime when it doesn't exist. And we make a political agenda that gets votes for elected officials. And nobody's really monitoring the result here. I think anytime this type of stuff happens, there should be a societal impact statement, like an environmental impact statement. What is the consequence, or what are the consequences of this type of behavior, this type of policy? Nobody's doing policy analysis. And this can go clear back to 9/11. We got a bunch of people taking flight instructions on large airplanes. And it's how do you fly them? Nothing about landing or anything like that. That should be a tip-off. The circumstances of them going to the flight school should have been monitored, and somebody should have been analyzing it. We don't have analysts anymore. What we do is we work on the theory is we'll collect data from everybody, and collecting data scares the hell out of everybody, and they should know that if they screw up or something goes wrong, we've got all these records and we can get them. Well, getting them doesn't help prevent things. Uh, and you got a lot of radicals out there that say, okay, so it's a game of get them. So what? You got me. I'm a radical. I don't care. I'm going to do it anyway. I'm going to strap a bomb to myself and kill myself. And until we start figuring out who these people may be, the self-immolation and bombings are going to continue. So we do need analysts, and we can have analysts as long as we got a bunch of dichotomous thinkers checking boxes and saying that they've done their job. All of these assholes ought to be fired, in my estimation. And that's my rant for today. I hope you enjoy, and I do hope you start making comments. I'd like to know how I'm doing in your estimations and things like this. So you guys have a good day. Bye.